Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to this year's ECVA. And I'm so sorry I cannot join you in person, given how important the agenda of character education has become also to the work of the OECD. The pandemic has reminded us how vulnerable our world is to disruptions, and the future will always surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic, and artificial intelligence puts to a test so many things we took for granted. We know how to educate second-class robots, people who are good at repeating what we told them. But what makes us human in a world in which the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have also become easy to digitize and automate? And there's so many other disruptors that we would need to factor into, our thoughts on the future of education. When we look at the last 20 years, just think how technology has transformed our societies, our lives. To some extent, the question of what we should be learning. But then, when we do our PISA assessments, we can see that, education has not really responded to those kinds of changes. At least on average across countries. Of course, there are some countries that have, improved their academic skills. You can see Singapore moving from good to great. You can see parts of China, Japan, Estonia in Europe doing really well. You can look at Portugal, Italy moving up, Israel, Turkey, very impressive improvements, Romania, and so on. You see a few countries, a dozen countries or so, that have, moved the needle and improve their academic outcomes. And that gets us, to the rank of countries that you can see in the kind of international league tables. But, let's look at this in a little bit more detail. I just highlighted Singapore's success in moving from good to great in academic education. They get 10 out of 10 points on the PISA assessments. But, when you look beyond the surface, you can see there are many areas where Singapore can advance. You can see, Singaporean kids are not that happy. They don't show as much emotional resilience as you would expect in the world in which we live. Now, kids understand that they need to reimagine, reinvent themselves every day when the world around them changes. You can see the quality of social relationships is not so strong in Singapore. Students have a hard time managing their lives beyond school. So you can see, our focus on academic performance sometimes makes us, lose sight of important character qualities that are important in tomorrow's world. You can look to the other end of the world, Peru. You can see the yellow bar is very short. Kids are not doing well on math and science and reading, but Peruvian kids are happy, much happier than on average across OECD countries. They show a good level of agency. They can mobilize their cognitive, social, emotional resources to do something, to take action. They show a good level of emotional resilience, strong social relationships. But, obviously not ideal because academic outcomes are too low. And sometimes, people think about this as a contrast. They say, well, maybe we have to make a choice. Either, we focus on character and then we compromise academic outcomes, or we push, young people very much on the academic front and then we lose sight of, the social emotional outcomes or character qualities. But, Austria is a good example. It, has recently seen drops in academic outcomes. That's a concern, absolutely. But on many of the other dimensions, Austria is actually doing pretty well. But you can do better. You can look at Denmark, strong academic outcomes, great psychological well-being, great level of agency, good level of resilience, strong engagement with schools, students taking active roles as learners, good social relationships, strong, school leisure balance, and so on. And those kinds of dimensions will be increasingly important in tomorrow's world. If you think about, some of the broader trends that shape the future of education, one trend that we can see, right, in Europe today is that global conflict is on the rise now. that is something that, has direct consequences on learning, on education, on the context in which young people grow up. It also fuels international migration, something also that, young people see in their schools in terms of greater student diversity. Some people say, our democracies are in decline. A clear signal is that voter turnout in parliamentary elections is dropping in Europe and elsewhere. We see that rise in populism in Europe. If you add the far right populist, the far left populist, the far left, you can see about almost a third of voters are now opting for the forces of polarization rather than, social cohesion. And then you can see artificial intelligence, rising exponentially. You can see the way it's being deployed and used. You can see that reflected in the demand and supply of AI-related skills, but also very important in the nature of skills that are very important. Here's some data from the United States. The skill category that is steepestly rising are social skills. You can see routine skills dropping, non-routine analytic skills rising, but most importantly, social skills on the rise. That also relates to the digital world. The digital world offers us amazing possibilities, but at the same time, we also see, digital addictions being on the rise now. Globally, smartphone addiction, social media addiction. When you look at the time that young people spend on digital devices just in school, you can see in some countries that gets close to the number of hours they spend learning in school. Now, in Ukraine, it's actually, more time that students spend on digital devices than they spend in front of a teacher. Now, of course, that's not by choice. That's by the necessity of, this horrible war. But in many other countries where, the context is favorable, still, the digital world is becoming the real world. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Does it, foster academic outcomes and character or work against it? Well, we have some interesting data on that. When you look at the time spent on digital devices and performance in mathematics, you can see actually when technology is used for learning in school, in a kind of instructional setting, teacher-directed, you can see actually it could be a good force. It could actually do something for academic learning. But you can see when students use technology for leisure, it really works against outcomes. And, that's the kind of smartphone problem in schools. And you can see the reasons for that. You can see a good share of young people, in South America, it's, over 50% say, I can no longer concentrate in mathematics because, I get distracted by my own phone or by my neighbor using their phone. So you can see that downside on mathematics performance. But we see also, negative effects on, life satisfaction, on the capacity of students to control their emotions, on stress resistance. Maybe that is one of the reasons why mental health has now risen to the top of concerns. Many other things that we used to worry in the past are declining in importance. So if we put all of this together, we can say, there's always been a race between education and technology. Before the first industrial revolution, neither technology nor education made a big difference for the vast majority of people. We lived pretty self-sufficient in our, fields. The Industrial Revolution was the first time when technology massively moved ahead of the capabilities of people, leaving lots of people in deep social pain. But that's, when we invented the kind of schooling that we have today, making people compatible with the norms of the industrial society. Now, that was very much about, knowledge, not so much character education. But now we have the digital revolution. Once again, technology is racing at breathtaking speed ahead of the capabilities of people. And we see that growing social pain again. You have young people finishing university, having difficulties finding a great job. And at the same time, employers say, we cannot find the people with the qualities that we need. And character is very much at the frontier. The question, therefore, is, how do we move, once again, the human capabilities ahead of the technologies of our times. And of course, it's always a balancing act. It's a balancing act between, keeping this world in balance, giving young people the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes and values to foster sustainability, but also to live in a world that is structurally imbalanced. So when you think about flourishing and character education, what do we expect from education today? Well, I think the first thing is probably easy to agree. Education should help you find out why you are here on this planet. Now, what is important to you? Where you can make a difference in this world. It should help you find out, what your talents are, where you can become really, really good at. And that's not a trivial process. Much of our education has become like a supermarket, offering young people lots of choices. But, it takes a very good tutor, a mentor, a coach in your teacher who helps you understand, where your talents really are. But, your passion alone never makes you happy in life. What makes us typically happy is to understand our vocation. What does this world expect from me? Where can I make my contribution? And ultimately, translate my knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values in better jobs and better lives. Well, easy to say, but the world is big. There's so many things that you could be teaching. And they always come through and with people. That's really, really important. Your favorite subject in primary school had probably a lot more to do with your teacher than with the content of the subject. And the curriculum is just a tiny box. And what we are trying to do often is to squeeze all of the beautiful, rich features of this world into this tiny box. But what often happens is that they arrive at very shallow shadows of themselves. Because we only talk about the surface content, we reduce, the beautiful features of our societies, of the world of knowledge, into very shallow shadows. I'm a scientist by background. And it sometimes breaks my heart when I see how we teach science like religion. We make young people believe in some scientific theory, then we give them lots of exercises to practices. At the end we test, do they remember our answers? That has nothing to do with science. Science is always about, questioning the wisdom of our times, not reproducing it. But, that happens, and then, more and more things end up like this. And we often end up in a world where learning is a mile wide, but just an inch deep. I show you one piece of data. We recently looked at creativity among 10 and 15-year-olds. And what you can see here is that in most education systems for which we have data, 15-year-olds reported lower levels of creativity than 10-year-olds. If I would tell you here, your 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-olds, you would say that's crazy. School always adds some value. But maybe not. Maybe sometimes, school can take away some of the qualities that are really, really important. So we ask ourselves, what are the drivers of creative skills? How can we foster creativity? And knowledge is the context for this, but there's a lot more that is needed. First is about, the beliefs young people have about creativity. You can see very, very clearly education systems that are able to foster a growth mindset. Now, where students have that belief, if I try hard, my teacher's going to help me, I'm going to be successful. Those education systems tend to do also well on academic outcomes and on creativity. Whereas education systems where students, believe that, it's all about the intelligence I was born with, I can't do anything about it, those education systems are not generally successful. So beliefs are really, really important. You can also say, attitudes towards creative thinking. You can see in this chart very, very clearly that creative thinking is associated with, imagination, being adventurous. It's being associated with being open to intellect, experiencing art, and also having that sense of self-efficacy. And there you can see how important, character is in developing even academic skills or skills like creativity. Students' beliefs and social emotional characteristics. You can see very clearly where students are willing and able to take different perspectives, appreciate different ways of thinking, see different arguments in a debate. They're more creative, where they display their greater curiosity, persistence, stress resistance, assertiveness, cooperation, being more in control of their emotion. They tend to be more creative thinkers. So this tells us that, creativity is something that we can foster. We're not very good at that. You could say we're losing it often, but actually the key to fostering it is not so difficult. So this is how we can move from this kind of mile-wide, inch-deep learning where students pile up lots of abstract knowledge to fostering greater focus on what really matters in this world in which we live. The realm of human knowledge, the realm of ethics and judgment, the realm of political and civic life, the realm of economic life, the realm of creativity, aesthetics, design. Very, very important. So, in conclusion, how do we do that? One reaction that we often have is, we need more time in schooling. And you can see the time that students spend learning varies hugely across countries. Here I have marked in blue the time that students spend learning in school, and then, in green, study hours out of school. In Morocco, students spend more than 50 hours of learning, or almost 50 hours learning. In Switzerland, it's less than 30. Huge variability in the volume of learning time. But when you look at productivity, you can see that students in Switzerland learn a lot in very little time, whereas students in Morocco spend a lot of time and learn very little. So it's not about the volume of learning time. It's very much about the quality of learning experiences now. And that comes squarely to the quality of teachers. What you can see here is the degree to which young people feel supported by their teacher. It's one of the most powerful predictors of their willingness and engagement with learning. To be self-directed, self-motivated learners. That's what we need in the 21st century. Not just students who just absorb passively what people tell them, but who have that, curiosity to set their own learning goals, to manage their learning process. And you can see one of the most powerful predictors is simply the extent to which students feel their teachers supporting them. Having a teacher who understands who you are and who you want to become and who supports you on this journey is so incredibly important. And not just on self-directed learning, you can see also that when it comes to academic outcomes, it's an incredibly powerful predictor. Last point, we often worry about student anxiety these days. And what happens is that we try to make learning easier for students. We say, students get so worried, they have mental, health issues, so we should not put so many demands on them. We see no relations on that. Basically, the demands placed on young people have no relation to the anxiety that they feel. The more important predictor is the degree to which students feel supported by their teacher. If they feel intimidated by their teacher, you can see anxiety goes up. If they feel supported by their teacher, you can see anxiety goes down. If, for example, you ask young people, if you come back in 3 years' time to your school, do you think your teachers will be excited to see you? Where students have that belief, that students see their teacher, as a coach, as a mentor, as a facilitator, as an evaluator, not just, as an instructor, as a friend, someone who understands them, who supports them. You can see those kids actually are less worried, however demanding school is for them. So that's why it is so important that we define education not as a transactional business, but as a social, a relational experiences. We look at the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes and values, all of which together, frame what we call character. The idea is that, young people in tomorrow's world need to have the kind of qualities that will make them, successful. They need to have the knowledge, the skills and attitudes to adapt to the worlds that they live in. They need to have that sense that they can make a difference in this world, to feel that agency, that that they can shape their environment actively, that they take responsibility for themselves, for other people, that they can articulate their experiences, that they can address and overcome challenges, that they see change not as a threat but as an opportunity. That's really, really important. All, easy to say, hard to do in practice. It means, if we want to go that road, we have to assess risks and leverage opportunities. Where do we strike the balance between modernizing education and disrupting it? How do we reconcile those new goals? The emergence of character as an important outcome of education with the old structures that are still, very much geared to the transmission of knowledge. How do we help young people to become globally minded but still rooted in their local culture, in their local tradition? That's a really, really important part. If you do not have that floor under your feet, that floor of being rooted in your culture, you're going to build walls around you, however self-defeating that is going to be in your life. How do we, foster innovation in an environment that is still very risk-averse? Change the exams, and you're going to have lots of people standing up and putting up resistance. How do we reconcile potential, what is possible, what is doable? How do we balance the virtual and the face-to-face world? You could see that the virtual world opened us enormous possibilities for education and learning, but also there are some big risks, and those risks may be even more pronounced for character than just for academic learning. And finally, how do we rebalance education and learning? Well, I'm sure you will find good answers to all of those questions at this conference here. Thank you very much.